Welcome to Modern Education. My guest today is Thomas Valente, PhD. He is a professor in the Department of Preventative Medicine at the Institute for Prevention Research at the Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California. He's the author of multiple books, including Network Models of the Diffusion of Innovations, and over 140 articles and chapters on social networks, behavior change, and program evaluation. Valente uses social network analysis, health communication, and mathematical models to implement and evaluate health promotion programs designed to prevent tobacco and substance abuse, unintended fertility, and STD/HIV infections. He's also engaged in mapping community coalitions and collaborations to improve healthcare delivery and reduce healthcare disparities. Valente received his BS in mathematics from the University of Mary Washington, his MS in mass communication from San Diego State University, and his PhD from the Annenberg School for Communication at USC. First, I want to just invite him on the air here and welcome to the show. Dr. Valente, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's such a joy to have you on the air. Thanks for making the time. So I wanted to start and give the audience a little tour of how you ended up being where you are. If you could give us a little bit of the story about how you became a researcher in the topics where you're at and what led you to get there.
Sure. It certainly wasn't a straightforward path, and as many young people struggle with trying to figure out what they're going to do in the world, you won't be surprised to find out that that answer comes in strange and varied ways, and it's oftentimes not particularly clear. So for me, I went to college. I was very excited about learning. I enjoyed college, and I studied a variety of different topics, but settled on math, primarily theoretical math and cryptology as an area that I was interested in. And at that time, I had developed a little bit of an affinity for mathematical models of communication, just looking at coding and encoding and decoding and that sort of thing. I got a job as an actuary in Washington, D.C., which turned out to be a god-awful profession. I didn't last very long there and realized at that point that unless I found a career that I was enthusiastic about and enjoyed, I wasn't going to make much in the world. So I decided to follow my passion in communication and enrolled in the master's program at San Diego State, where I studied telecommunications and film as well as journalism. And it was there that I discovered social science and the notion of doing research. And in particular, I discovered diffusion of innovations theory, which I was quite taken with and enjoyed quite a bit. So I took a detour to move to Japan for a year and then enrolled at the Annenberg School for Communication at USC to study diffusion of innovations, primarily with my advisor, Everett Rogers, who's very well known as one of the founders of diffusion of innovations theory. And then after I finished my PhD, I got a job at Johns Hopkins University in the School of Public Health, evaluating communication campaigns to promote family planning and reproductive health. I like to say that I cut my teeth on family planning. And there did a bunch of research evaluating the effects of communication campaigns to promote health, and as well as pursuing my passion in social network analysis. And when I was first learning about diffusion of innovations theory, I went through the literature quite extensively and discovered that really the number one influence on people's decisions to engage in a new behavior, adopt a new behavior, is communication with their close friends, their colleagues, their peers, and it's that peer influence that's very important. And thus I discovered social networks. And social network analysis at that time was a small field. Not very many people were studying it, and in fact, I was dissuaded by many people of pursuing this as a topic because it was considered at that time theoretically vacuous and methodologically moribund. But that didn't stop me, and I sort of stuck with it and continued to pursue my passion on social networks. Started applying it to health, where there were a lot of obvious applications, and through the 90s. Developed that field, and then in 2000, in graduate school, I met a very beautiful woman who was in my statistics class. We had statistics together, and I persuaded her to marry me, and she was from Los Angeles. And so in 2000, we decided to move back to California. I was lucky enough to get a position here at USC directing a newly created Master's in Public Health program. And then for the past couple of decades, nearly, I've been here at USC pursuing research on social network analysis, social network influences on health, myself and have been pleased to see that the field of social networks has grown quite substantially in the past couple of decades, primarily because we have better tools, better data collection methods, and an appreciation for the importance of networks and connectivity for all aspects of the physical, biological, and social sciences.
Wow, that is quite a story and so succinct. I really appreciate you being able to fit all that in so quickly for the audience. I can't help but wondering what the probability is of meeting your wife in a statistics class, but So I can't also help but asking, just because I'm in math education and I noticed that you started in mathematics and now you're working in other fields, more social science oriented, but still using mathematics within your work. And I'm wondering if, just for real quick, you could give us a comment or your thoughts on how important your learning and your training in mathematics is now, even though you're not working directly in that field.
It's actually been critical, and I think the main thing was that studying math, and I also had 2 courses in logic, taught me to think systematically, and it's that systematic thinking and being in my career that enabled me to do, I think, well with my research. The second thing is, of the math that I use now is pretty simple, primarily basic linear algebra, matrix multiplication, and so it's helpful to us. Although it's really not particularly complicated math, but again, I think that logic has helped me a lot when it comes to doing statistical analysis and writing R code to analyze social networks.
Yeah, and like I said, I just couldn't resist to ask because I think so many people don't understand the relevance of mathematics in their learning, and I think your example is really a powerful one to understand that you don't need to do mathematics to benefit from the learning that happens there. So I appreciate you.
Exactly.
Thanks for indulging me on that for a minute.
My pleasure.
Okay, so now let's talk about this network thing, right? And I think it'd be nice if we could maybe start with a personal story about how networks have been effective in your life, or maybe how networks have been, your knowledge of networking and network awareness, I guess I would say, has changed the way you think about or maybe see the world or your relationships.
Well, to be clear, I think networks are absolutely the most critical part of life, and it's our relationships that we have that make all the difference to our physical and mental well-being. And the work that I do is collaborative. I work with lots of other people and could not be successful without the aid and cooperation and collaboration of all those colleagues. Most importantly, my wife, who has been an inspiration and a key sounding board and collaborator for just about all the work that I've done. So networks, I think, are critically important. It's how we make sense of the world around us. It's how we spend our free time when we have stuff that we want to do. We want to do it with other people and be enthused and energized and invigorated by our contacts, our collaborators, our close ties. And it's my belief, and I think the literature will bear this out a little bit, most of us have 2 or 3 really close friends or confidants or even family members to whom we rely on and spend the most time, and they are the most critical influences on our behavior and on our decisions. And I believe that the more consequential the decision you're going to make, the more important those close, strong ties are to making that decision. If I want to make a big change in my life, I'm going to consult my closest friends, my partner, the people that are nearest to me in order to make that decision.
Yeah, so it sounds to me what you're talking about is the idea, or maybe being honest about the value of socially constructed knowledge and building up an understanding about how your network and your communication within that network actually does expand your ability to rationally or preparedly decide and make big life decisions or even small ones.
Absolutely true, yeah. And it's our main way that we find out about things, and it's the way we sort of make sense of the world and enable us to get through it. And I think you'll find in the literature, of course, that most people who lead long, healthy, happy lives are people that also have good relationships.
Yeah, I remember a study looking at a whole lifetime of a group of people, and they showed that the people who had the longest health and longevity were also the people who had the most social connections and support. And I think that speaks.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean you have to have a lot of social connections. What it means is that you need to have at least some, and that they are of high quality.
Right. Yeah, it's that quality over quantity. You can have 1,000 acquaintances, and that's not going to give you the support that 5 close friends would.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is extremely salient for people to think about right now. I mean, I think our lives right now are very much starting to be more and more disconnected and more individualistic. And it seems like a really great reminder for people to understand that value of your social interactions and your social networks is bigger than just what people can offer you, but also how you can become more clear on what you want and where you're headed because of that input.
Right. And increasingly with our social media, we need to understand that the media contacts and capabilities aren't substitutes for good, strong, quality relationships, but they can be supplemental and helpful to keeping engaged and keeping in touch.
Yeah, and that actually leads me right to my next question, which is what makes a strong connection? Or another way to think about that maybe is what makes a person influential within your network?
I think it's somebody that you know well, trust, spend time communicating with, and have formed a strong and lasting bond with. And so those things take time. A colleague of mine just published a paper estimating that it takes about 200 hours of contact with somebody before you consider it. So there is, Jeff Hall, by the way, is the researcher who published that out of University of Kansas, that you have to take time and put energy into relationships to make them work. And it does take effort. And I know that sounds silly, and people say, oh, it should just come naturally. It should, not be a problem. But actually, you have to extend yourself out there. You have to put trust in other people, and you have to allow yourself to be a little bit vulnerable in order for those relationships to develop and grow. And then you build that trust over time. And once it's there, it is very important and critical to maintain, but you'll be thankful the rest of your life that you have it.
Yeah. And I really love the way you're highlighting how important that trust and time is, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to actually establish that connection. These things, there's no shortcutting to this, right? You have to actually allow it to evolve, which is sort of a progressively more disclosing relationship. It starts out small, and you build up trust, and you build up that ability to really have that close connection. It can't just happen because 2 people lock eyes in a room.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it takes a while.
Right.
And, oddly enough, I mean, human beings are strange, but we have affinities for different kinds of people. So I think it's always interesting to see how these things emerge. And we do a lot of research looking at adolescents, either in middle school or high school, asking them to name their friends in their grade or in their school. And we can watch those networks evolve and change over time and become structured. It's a fascinating process.
Yeah, I'd actually love to hear some more about that and the process of how you go about looking at and assessing a network, or how you go about understanding where the strong ties or connections are within an organization or a group.
Yeah, it turns out to be relatively straightforward and simple. When we give surveys to people all the time, and it turns out that, we oftentimes make rather cognitively demanding questions, asking people to agree or disagree to a bunch of statements that may or may not be relevant to them. But one thing that is particularly relevant to everybody are their networks. And so when we go into schools, we can give them a survey asking them about some of their risk behaviors and their obese-related types of behaviors. And then we can simply ask them, write down the names of your closest friends. Now, we can do that by, say, just write down the names of your 5 or 7 or 12 closest friends, in which case we've got to do a considerable amount of data cleaning. The other thing that we do is attach a roster or even a yearbook-type set of pages with pictures and ID numbers, and simply ask the students to write down the ID numbers of their closest friends. We give them a survey, and we can ask them to write down the names of their 5 or 7 closest friends, in which case we've got to do a considerable amount of data cleaning. The other procedure that we follow more regularly is to give them a survey, and at the back of it, attach a yearbook type style, a bunch of photographs with ID numbers, and simply ask the students to write down the ID numbers of their closest friends, those whom they want to have a romantic relationship with, those whom they think are popular or successful, and then those data are easily entered into the computer. And we have a lot of specialty programs that allow us to map those networks and then overlay the behaviors that they've reported on them. And you can see the clustering of tobacco use, for example, or drinking behavior. We know, for example, that a student that has smoking friends is more than 2 times as likely to become a smoker in the following year. And we can analyze obesity behaviors through that network, all kinds of different health behaviors that we might be interested in. And we find, not surprisingly, that for all of the health behaviors we've analyzed, the network influences are particularly strong, stronger even than parental ones or other types of attitudinal or socio-demographic characteristics.
Wow. So this sounds like a relatively simple strategy that is yielding some powerful leverage within the networks you're examining.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And not only are they powerful influences, but we've now figured out that we can use that information to design more effective behavior change programs, so-called network interventions, in which we take the network data and in a school, for example, identify the most popular kids and ask them to be proponents of a healthy behavior, a smoking prevention program, or a bullying prevention program, and so on and so forth.
So how do you go about recruiting these kids or people in general when you're trying to do stuff like this?
So we've had a considerable amount of experience with this, and it turns out that once these leaders are identified, they're quite willing to participate in our behavior change programs. Why? Because they know that they're somewhat popular and people are coming to them. So, for example, if we go into a hospital and ask physicians, who do you go to for advice about a particular clinical issue, when we identify those physician opinion leaders, they know they're opinion leaders because people come to them. So they're now glad to be identified and rewarded and acknowledged as leaders, but then also to give them materials that they can use to promote better practices. And that's something that they would like to do. They don't want to have people come and ask them questions and not have materials to give them answers. So they're more than happy to participate in learning with their leaders and then learning how to go about doing behavior change promotions.
Okay, so it sounds like you appeal somewhat to their altruistic tendencies and their desire to help others, and maybe a little bit to their egos, to let them know that they actually do hold this position within their group or their society, and let them take ownership over that. So just making explicit something that exists already.
Exactly, yeah. And so it tends to work very, very well. In fact, the literature shows that these opinion leader interventions are quite effective at changing behaviors. This primarily comes from working with physicians in medical care settings, and a meta-analysis just published by the Cochrane Review about 5 or 6 years ago showed that the opinion leader approach was more effective compared to other kinds of interventions.
Wow. So there's been a lot of work happening here. I don't ever hear about this. I mean, this isn't something that you see on the news in the evening or something that it seems like part of regular conversation. Why isn't this more central to, I mean, it seems like every single thing out there, every business is looking to change behaviors, looking to influence people towards, maybe more productive or more sales, or it depends on what their goal is. Is this something that is mainstream and just sort of hidden behind the curtains, or is this not yet caught on?
You asked a very good question, and I have been puzzled why every hospital and medical care organization in this country isn't routinely doing and collecting this kind of behavior amongst their clinicians and providers in order to improve performance. This should be happening all the time, and it's not. And I'm at a loss to explain why. I've been doing everything I can to promote this approach and try to get people to adopt it more widely. And it just seems to be that people don't want to go through the trouble, that networks are obvious, but why should we do that? Because we're just going to do things the way we've always done them rather than bringing in something that requires a change.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of hesitancy because for people of a generation like mine, we tend to think that network information should be confidential. That if I provide names of people I go to for advice, that nobody should be aware of that. But if you talk to younger people, they have their networks writ large on their phones and their mobile devices, and they're more than happy to share their network information. So I think it's a generational thing.
that seems promising, because if we are planning for the next generation to do better than the last one, it seems like they're primed and ready for these type of interventions.
I think that's absolutely true. And the important thing to realize is that there are opinion leaders in any organization for different domains. So the person who's going to be opinion leader for one clinical condition might not be one for a different clinical condition, or even administrative changes in policies that need to be enacted. So everybody can play a leadership role. And for me, in an ideal world, everybody in an organization is given some domains to which they're responsible for keeping an eye on the literature and on what's happening, and then communicating it back to their networks.
Wow. Yeah. So my next question is, it seems like there's a little bit of a barrier to entry, that people don't understand how quickly they could get started, or maybe how accessible this type of approach to organizational change could be. What would it take for somebody who wanted to get started or create some sort of small-scale introductory intervention to test the waters of this type of analysis? What is, just like, broad strokes, the skeleton of what it would take to actually start?
So, there is this whole field of network analysis. People teach network courses, and so ideally one would take a network course to get an understanding of the literature. The literature has been around for a long time. In fact, at Stanford University, you have a professor in the sociology department named Mark Granovetter, who wrote some of the most influential papers on social network analysis as early as the 1970s. So there's a literature out there. It's good to take a course to get an understanding of the field, but then really start getting training on the techniques of social network analysis, how to collect the data, how to analyze it, and how to use it for designing interventions. I published a paper in Science called Network Interventions, which outlines some of the methodologies and choices that are available. And I think a person can pretty readily come up to speed on how to do this kind of work. There are computer packages for analyzing the data, and the thing is, it's so intuitive that you can really pretty quickly pick up the basic skills needed to do network analysis.
Wow. Okay. So it doesn't sound like it's going to take a life's work to be able to get into this. It sounds like a little bit of forethought, putting in some time to figure out the basics, and then maybe figuring out a goal of what you want to accomplish, and then finding out who the leaders are within that framework.
Yep. And then, from my perspective, our job is to sort of provide the network supports to enable organizations and communities to enact the change themselves. The whole point of doing network analysis is to let the community have the power and its own data in order to enact change, because change doesn't come from the outside. It has to come from the inside.
Right. So what type of data do you share with the people participating in this type of venture?
Typically, when we collect network data, say amongst coalitions or in community-based organizations, after we collect the data, we'll report it back to them and say, okay, here are the organizations or the individuals that are the leaders that have the most responsibility and power. Here are the gaps in the network. Here are the places where there are people and organizations that are not connected that perhaps should be. And then we also look for other ways that we might strengthen the network. We can calculate which kinds of links you can add or delete in order to make the network more cohesive or more structured, and so on. Critically, one of the things that we look at is the clustering in a network. It turns out that your friends tend to be friends with each other. So there's a lot of what we call transitive closure in networks. And that can be a good thing sometimes, but it can also inhibit change in other settings. So it's important to understand what those structural metrics look like when you collect the data and report it back to your colleagues and community partners.
So this transitive closure sounds like basically a closed loop where you're not getting diffusion because everything is sort of cyclic within that group?
Exactly, right. And what Mark Granovetter observed a long time ago is that there are weak ties in networks, and those weak ties tend to be very strong in information, because the weak ties, when you don't have the transitive closure, what you get is access to new and novel information that can be helpful for making change.
Okay, so these weak ties sound kind of like the traveling salesman that brings an idea from town to town and is not necessarily part of the community, but is the person that sort of brings the good word from the next town over, so to speak.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Now, we've talked decently about how to set up and approach starting this. How do you know if it's being successful, like midstream or at the end, if there is such a thing for this type of approach?
Well, what we've done in the public health realm, of course, is evaluate the effectiveness of our program. So we typically try to collect some data on attitudes and behaviors, and then after we implement our network intervention, we go back and collect that data a second time and see where our health indicators or other indicators are pre and post. Ideally, we have a randomized controlled trial where some units have the network intervention and others have not. And when we've done those studies, we found that network approach to be quite successful. So there are basic techniques of program evaluation, and those techniques and practices should follow when evaluating these programs.
Okay, so that gets us a baseline in the beginning and a result in the end. And is there a timeline that generally is accepted as long enough to make real change?
Yeah, so usually a year. A lot of times we, our grant funding is curtailed to no more than 3 or 5 years. So to do one of these under funding from the National Institutes of Health, for example, who has funded a number of my studies, and I'm thankful to them for that, we typically will have 1 year or 2 year follow-up data collection.
Okay. That's very helpful. Yeah. So I wanted to just shift gears a little bit. I think people maybe thinking about this or listening in might be sort of interested in the viral aspect of spreading information and ideas. And I'm wondering if this is connected or if this has been looked at from a social media or a YouTube perspective, people trying to promote themselves or promote their cause or even social change, things like that.
Certainly, that's true. Theory and diffusion theory to inform things that we understand about the way ideas and practices spread through social media and through other electronic forums, if you will. And there's a fair amount of that. One of the things that we struggled with from a purely theoretical point of view is distance medium from the message or the behavior. So if I retweet something, I've simultaneously adopted the idea and generated a network link at the same time. So the measurement of the network and the behavior are not independent. So some of our traditional classical tools have not been as helpful for understanding that diffusion as they could be.
Huh, okay.
It's trying to apply diffusion theory to this new, not so new anymore, but the new media landscape that we find ourselves in.
So it sounds like maybe the scholarship has not caught up yet with the new paradigms of...
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, okay. So and then there's a rich field there for people who wanted to dive into things like this. If people are looking to build up something like this, that sounds like a wide open field to really develop these ideas.
It is, and of course we've now intersected with precisely one of the predominant discussions of the day, which is privacy, and social media firms being reluctant to share data because they want to keep it private, and people have every right to keep it private. So the intersection between our desire to do scholarly research on this, its need for privacy in their social media lives are now in.
Let's move over to this idea of tie strength. So this is something we talked about in the pre-interview, and can you give us an outline of what tie strength is and how that comes into play with all this?
Yes, Granovetter did a great job of introducing this idea, and he described tie strength as being a function of emotional closeness, time spent with one another, and potentially having a lot of characteristics in common. So I think fundamentally tie strength is how close do you feel to someone, how much do you trust them, and it may or may not be somebody that you spend the majority of your time communicating with. We may have colleagues that we work with a lot but are not our closest strong ties. But from my understanding, most people have, 3 to 5 really close ties, people that they consider their confidants, that energize them, that they like to spend their free time with. or even to spend their work time with. And I think those strong ties are absolutely critical to understanding how networks influence people's behavior, because those strong ties, as I said before, are the key influences on behavior. Now, weak ties generally are people that travel in social circles that are different than yours, and they spend time with people and in environments that are different than the ones that you spend time in. So as a consequence, you may not see them very often, but when you do see them, they can be rich in information because they've been traveling in circles and communicating with people other than the people that you normally communicate with. That being said, I think those weak ties are really good for spreading of rumors, for information, for raising awareness about ideas or job opportunities, for example. But it's the strong ties that make a big difference when you make a decision to do something. And the more consequential that decision, the more important tie strength is.
Okay, so the people who are closest to us and have the most deep and frequent connection are the ones that are going to influence our behavior more, but the weak ties are going to bring in more new information and opportunity and perhaps help us promote something that is not necessarily going to be as easily promoted by our close ties. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep, that's it. You got it.
Okay.
You're on your way to becoming a network theorist.
Maybe. Who knows? Yeah. So is it that just being close to people makes them influential regardless of how qualified they are or how good of their advice is? It really is just how much time we spend with them or frequency?
Yeah, and your emotional closeness to them. Now, one of the things that we've discovered is people tend to nominate as influential people, those that they go to for advice, others that are just like themselves, only more so. And by that I mean that we tend to look one rung up on the ladder to model our behavior. So I don't look to people who are at the top of the world and have them be influences on my behavior. It's people that are doing just slightly better than I am, because that's what I can aspire to. So as human beings, we're really good at aspiring to do 10% better than we do. So when we nominate people that we go to for advice, they're going to be people that are slightly better educated than the average individual, slightly taller, better looking, more gregarious, whatever. But again, only one rung up on the ladder, not 2 or 3 rungs above me, because that's what I can aspire to. I can't aspire to something that's 5 rungs above me on the ladder, but I can aspire to get 1 step up.
So a person who is this shining example of excellence is probably not going to be that inspiring to somebody because it doesn't seem attainable to them. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yep.
Okay. So if that seems actually like a very promising thing for people who are trying to create change. You don't need 10 superstars that are just going to blow everyone out of the water. You just need a few people who are slightly more well put together than the people you're trying to change or help change.
Exactly. Yep. And that kind of leadership is local, you know?
Right. So there's presumably many of these people in every organization, every business, every school, every doctor or hospital, right?
Exactly. Yep, that's absolutely true.
Okay, so this doesn't seem like something where you need to call in the best experts from every field and bring them in to give these wowing presentations to get people to change, that you already have the resources and the human capital probably existing and even wanting to be recognized right within your organization.
That's precisely true. Exactly.
Wow. That's such a promising thing. I mean, it's probably the most salient goal in every organization to create change around some object or some cause. So you're laying out essentially a somewhat easy and accessible way to actually approach doing that.
I think that's absolutely true. And you don't have to pay a fortune to bring in the national expert. You've got the expertise locally, and that's going to be, by building that kind of social capital, that's going to be an effective, sustainable way to change a community. And again, it's coming from within the community or organization, not external to it.
Right. So are these people going to need a huge amount of training and behavior change themselves to be able to make their influence effective?
Not a lot of training, because remember, the people that are being nominated are ones that are already considered leaders and are probably already pretty good at communicating their ideas to other people. And one of the things that we found, typically when we go into organizations, we identify 2 different kinds of leaders, those that are high in expertise and those that are high in trust. you can identify leaders who are very expert, but they may not be as good communicators. And so when we ask the trust questions, who do you discuss clinical issues with, we're more likely to get those people that actually not only are they high in expertise, but they're also people that others trust and feel that they can go to in times of need.
Okay, so we're looking for somebody who fits the overlap.
Yep.
Both high in expertise and high in maybe emotional intelligence or communication skills, things like that.
Right. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's really, I think, a powerful way to approach it. Now, do we find maybe sometimes where the people who are high in expertise and the people who are high in communications skills need to work together, or do we only want the people who have that overlap between them?
It depends on what the behavior change challenge and domain area are. Because if what you're, if the change you're trying to bring about is...
Okay, we're just going to give it a few more seconds. This call is not the best connection, but we're working through it. And Dr. Valente is here on the line here on Modern Education, telling us about the change efforts through network modeling and being able to use that to elicit change within mostly hospitals, I think, is where this has been done. I'm waiting for Dr. Valente to reconnect. Hello, Dr. Valente. Are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. That is cell phones, right? We can never count on them. Okay. So we've been talking about... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we were talking about expertise and trust or communication capability, and one thing I was saying is that if the behavior change issue is not controversial, everybody knows what needs to be done, and it's more technical in nature, then those expertise opinion leaders are probably better able to play a prominent role. However, if the change is cultural, you really don't know what to do, then it's probably those trust or communication leaders would be more important.
So that's the idea of like a deviant change, something that's considered not within the norm.
Right. Radical.
Right.
Yep.
So when we're trying to do something more radical, something more against the tide of what's been done previously, the trust factor sounds like it's the more salient one.
Right.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about just an overview of where this has been used and what type of things have been actually changed using these types of strategies.
So most of the work has been done in medical care settings, not surprisingly. There's probably 15 or 20 randomized controlled trials using network data to identify opinion leaders and have them be proponents of change. And those are things, vaginal birth after first C-section, or using aspirin to treat acute myocardial infarction, or kidney disease, and so on and so forth. The other application has been adolescent tobacco use. There have been a couple of studies where network data have been collected, peer opinion leaders identified, and had them be proponents of tobacco prevention and even cessation programs. And those have been the two applications that have had the most data and the most experience. Why those things have been the ones that have been done the most? Probably because that's where the money and the opportunity has been. But certainly this could be extended to a lot of other areas.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's been some work using network analytic tools to understand substance abuse and HIV risk behavior among injection drug users, for example.
Yeah, so it sounds like this has been applied, but mostly just because there's more funding in these areas. And it's not that it wouldn't be useful in a lot of other areas, more that there hasn't been the money and resources put into it.
Exactly, yep.
Okay. So the first cause then is to familiarize yourself if you wanted to use this. And the next is to start finding ways to implement it within new domains, or maybe even reproducing some of the old stuff, as it seems like it's been very successful. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, yes.
Okay, great. Now, I'm curious, just from the standpoint of what's next. So where is this heading? Do you see this ever being a paradigm shift where this is how things are done? Unfortunately, the call is cutting out for a second. Hopefully we'll just hang tight and it will reconnect. Okay, well, we're just hanging on the line for a minute for Dr. Valente. Are you still there? Okay, well, we're just going to keep hanging here for a second. I think he's going to come back and tell us about why and how this is going to be used in the future and where maybe some of the struggles have been with getting this to be a more mainstream approach to behavior change. And it's such a joy to have Dr. Valente here on the line. He's been sharing all kinds of expertise and insight as far as how to implement his work and what it really takes to put the rubber to the road, so to speak. So hopefully the call will come right back. Dr. Valente, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me back?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. So
right.
we were just about to talk about making this mainstream.
There is a lot of growth in this field. As I mentioned earlier, it's an approach that's being now used both in the biological and physical sciences. There's been the emergence of I don't know if it's I guess a companion idea called network science. So there's journal network science, and there's been a lot of activity by computer scientists, mathematicians, and physicists to map very large networks and look at things like the structure of the World Wide Web or other kinds of large networks. So the notion of analyzing networks is really growing in a lot of different domains. Its application to public health programs also continues to grow, and there's quite a bit of, I think, enthusiasm and research that's being conducted in a lot of different domains. Is it mainstream yet? No. You would still consider it outside the normal paradigm of social science research. And I don't know if that will ever change, but potentially this network approach will continue to grow quite substantially because there is no limit to the applications. There's no public health or organizational behavior issue from which network approaches don't have application.
Wow. It sounds like somebody needs to take a large-scale network approach to promoting network analysis.
Yes.
Well, if anyone's going to do it, I guess it might have to be you because you are one of the top dogs in this field. So I certainly hope that this becomes something that is much more widely used and recognized as a powerful tool because it really seems to be so.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that, Ben. And of course, I think it gives us the opportunity to, at a sustainable and cost-effective way, improve the health of our communities and organizations.
Right, and that is such a powerful goal and so necessary in this day and age, and not only in this country, but in a lot of other countries. We could really use some clear goal-directed change that can help people on a large scale because individual change really is not enough, it seems, for the big problems we're facing today.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
I just want to get you to maybe ideate a little bit with me here. Could we approach something like global warming from a network perspective and hope to do something meaningful to change or turn the tide on something that big?
Well, I don't see why not. Of course, the reason global warming or climate change is an issue is because everything is connected, right? And so it is the connectedness of our systems that makes this climate change issue particularly problematic, and once it gets going, can spin out of control. So what do we need? Well, we probably need to figure out who the key decision makers are that are preventing us from adopting better climate change policies, and start strengthening the networks of sustainable producers of energy so that they feel better supported. I don't know if a massive network intervention would be possible in this domain, but it certainly seems like we ought to be able to start generating more enthusiasm for alternative energy sources and greater awareness of exactly what the climate change problem is.
So what would be some of the barriers to being able to affect this on such a large scale with such a deeply interconnected problem?
I think, and it's ironic, but, data have come out recently to show that ExxonMobil back in the 80s was aware of climate change and knew that this was a process that was ongoing. So I think the barrier is getting actors that are entrenched in denying climate change to start to, be persuaded that actually it is a problem and we really need to do something about it.
Wow, that goes right back to what you were saying about the more difficult deviant changes really do require the close trust and the close ties between people who already have trust with each other.
Exactly, yep.
Wow. Okay, what if we took it smaller? Like, if, say, a school wanted to turn its culture around and they wanted to help their students.
Yeah, you go into the school, measure the friendship networks, understand who the important people are that can lead change, and have them be proponents of, let's say, an anti-bullying campaign. Make sure that kids understand the importance of inclusiveness and how valuable it is to get along and not be exclusionary.
Yeah. Do you ever offer incentives to the change agents, or is this an intrinsic thing?
I think it's an intrinsic thing. I wouldn't be opposed to an experiment that tests whether or not that makes a difference. But I think in general, once people are identified as leaders, they're happy and proud to be leaders and assume that leadership role.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It speaks to just what we would like to do and what makes us feel good in the first place.
Right. And it tends to be within cliques that you find different leaders. So, for example, there's a tendency for teachers to pick certain kinds of kids to be the peer leaders in a class project or in a school project. But the teachers are going to pick certain kinds of kids, and there are going to be other clusters of kids, maybe kids that typically don't necessarily follow all the rules, but within those cliques, there are going to be leaders within them. So it's important to identify the leaders there as well.
Wow, yeah. So it sounds like a really powerful tool would just be giving regular people in their jobs a way to actually identify these opinion leaders or guiding participants to be able to more deliberately utilize that strength.
Yes.
Yeah, yep. Yeah. Great. Well, we're getting pretty close to being out of time here, so I just wanted to offer you a chance. If there's anything I didn't ask you or anything else you'd like to give to the audience as some final takeaways or encouragement to move forward with their own ideas of how to apply this?
Yeah, I think that the network metaphor, the network tools, network theory are all incredibly powerful. We've gathered a lot of evidence that supports that idea. And anybody can look at their own life and understand how important their networks are and their social relationships are. And so I would encourage everyone to make sure you invest time in those important social relationships and think about how networks can be used to improve our lives at the individual, community, organizational, and society level. And if we think through the network lens and use network tools, we have the opportunity to leave this planet a much better place than we have found it. And so there are lots of opportunities to learn more about social network analysis, and I encourage all of your listeners, if they have an interest, to do so, and you'll find it quite rewarding.
Yes, and if they wanted to start, maybe some of your books would be a good place for them to look, some of your publications, and some of your colleagues within the field would be a really good place for them to get started. It sounds like there's a lot out there.
Absolutely, yep.
Well, that is a great way to end. I really appreciate your time today and you going through some of these ideas so that our audience can hopefully try to find ways to make this relevant to the things that they want to change in the world.
Yep. Awesome, Ben. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr.
For inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
So this was Dr. Thomas Valente down at USC talking with us about the importance of networks and how they can be used to elicit change. I'm the host of Modern Education, Ben Woodford, and I want to thank the audience for listening in, and we will see you next week, Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. here on 90.1 KZSU Stanford.